Welcome everybody to this afternoon's seminar, although I don't know what time it is in Leeds at the moment, but we are very pleased to welcome Associate Professor Subhajit Basu from the School of Law at the University of Leeds. And without any further ado, over to you.
Thank you, Julian. It's actually 7 a.m. in Leeds, so not a bad time. I'm just going to do my screen share, and then I will. Can I screen share, please? I think I need permission to do it. Julian. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and that's it. So I can now share. Thank you so much for inviting me. So I'm a lawyer. Nobody likes lawyers, but anyway, so that's out of the way. So my research is focused on regulation of emerging technologies, and then for past couple of years, I've been looking into the area of regulating big techs, and particularly I'm interested in the regulation of online content, data protection, and privacy issues. Now, in this lecture, I will touch upon competition law areas because you have to. There's no way out of it. But I'm not a competition law lawyer, so that is I want to make you all aware of. Now, I will be touching upon the regulation of big techs on some of the perspectives, say data protection, competition law, privacy issues, and I will take you through what has been happening predominantly in Europe and in China when it comes to regulation of big techs. Now, if I tell you that the world's largest platform companies like Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, Alphabet, Meta, they are all accused of engaging in trade monopolies, controlling our behavior, it won't come as a surprise to you. Just think about Apple and its App Store. You do not have much of an option to go anywhere else to purchase anything once you have an iPhone. Amazon and its marketplace is very much controlled by Amazon, and Google's and its complete dominance in the online advertising area. All these companies use their position and their power to discriminate against new and existing sellers. They give preferential treatment to their own products. They bundle services, and they force them onto us as customers, as consumers. And perhaps what is worse for new businesses is that these big techs abuse their wealth of data to gain competitive advantage. And for us as citizens, as consumers, the problem does not end there. These companies, as I said at the very beginning, they influence our behavior, they control our behavior. And one of my favorite authors at the moment is obviously Shoshana Zuboff, and she quite nicely puts in her book, Surveillance Capitalism, that these big tech giants give us types of information over others. They decide on behalf of us what we want to know. And they secretly disclose our personal information to manipulate our behaviors. And this is done every day, virtually no oversight, with no transparency. And the success of these companies is driven by hidden surveillance of us and persistently monitoring our activities. And what we have seen so far, that a hands-off approach to regulation hasn't really worked that well. We thought it would, but it really hasn't. So I'm going to give you two examples to kind of justify why we need to regulate the big techs. The first, what we know from Facebook whistleblower Francis Haugen, that Facebook knowingly used algorithm to target advertisements at vulnerable children. And they basically profited from disinformation and hateful content. And we have seen them doing it during the past 2 years during the COVID pandemic, a lot of the infodemic was fueled by the social media. Twitter is no different. I have a quote here from the written statement that was submitted just a few days ago to the US Senate Judiciary Committee by Twitter's former security chief, Peter Zatko. He accused Twitter and its board of directors of grossly neglecting its security obligations. If you go through the 84-page whistleblower document, it paints quite a scary picture. It describes Twitter as a company without insight into its problems, and they do not seem to have a leadership to fix it. We know about because Elon Musk trying to buy Twitter, but it is a lot worse. Twitter neglected user privacy, knowingly employed government agents who had access to the internal systems and data. We know from his testimony that Indian government was forced Twitter to put government agents on their payroll. Indian government agency, we think, would have had access to sensitive user data because Twitter's very weak security infrastructure. The root cause is that the Twitter does not understand how much data it collects, why it collects, and how that data is supposed to be used. And what is more alarming is that half of Twitter's employees have access to that data, and without any justifiable reason. So it is no longer a question if we should regulate big tech, but we should try to find out how to regulate big techs. Now, for past few years, couple of years actually, 3 years, several policy initiatives have emerged in China and EU and United States in the areas of competition, data protection, business conduct, and financial stability in order to make an attempt to regulate big techs. But the problem is that the efforts have been disjointed. I purposely going to talk a little bit about China to show that, also it's an authoritarian regime, but it is also trying to do things the way it is done in countries, in places like Europe, US, and even in Australia. But I think in this whole endeavor of trying to take meaningful step to regulate big techs, European Union as a bloc is probably at the most advanced stage in proposing effective legislation. EU came up with a legislative proposal back in 2020 aimed at preventing large online platforms, the so-called gatekeepers. These are gatekeepers. These are big companies, big like the Facebook, Amazon, and Googles of the world, from abusing their market power. Now, I've been working in cyber law for 20 years, and I know what a bad law looks like. So it is one thing to say that we need regulation, but it is not that easy to do it. And we got it wrong so many times in past 25 years. And also, big techs makes it very complicated because they provide a wide range of services. And depending upon the jurisdiction, these companies provide, say, e-commerce. Somewhere they are social media, provide social media facilities. They are internet search engines, search devices, providing advertising facilities. You have telecommunication companies providing telecommunication facilities, payment services. Apple, Google, they're all involved in payment services now. Cloud computing services. So you've got all these different services they provide, different functions, roles they comply with. So to regulate these services in a coherent manner, we had to come up with two possible ways. The first is, obviously, we can make changes to existing laws that directly influence how big techs operate. And perhaps that is one of the easiest area. We can make changes to the data protection and data sharing laws and rules. because that is something we have been doing. We have been making progress in the area of data protection and data sharing for some time. And also remember this big takes, at their core business model is the data, is the consumer data, and the ability to gain insights from that user's data to provide a competitive advantage to their business. And if we manage to create a regulatory constraint on this ability, on this rampant ability, it would be a good thing. It would be an important step. And we know that several policy initiatives on data protection and data sharing have been taking place in EU, United States, and China. And of course, GDPR is one of the most influential pieces of legislation when it comes to data protection and data sharing. But there are different legislative initiatives that has also been put forward in the United States. You understand, US to have a federal law takes a lot longer time. It's not that they're not thinking about it, but perhaps the most ambitious data privacy legislation at a state level in US is the California Consumer Privacy Act. It requires that data subjects be informed about when and how data are collected. It gives them the ability to access, correct, and delete such information, ability to data subjects to access, correct, and delete information. Interesting, China, they also have a new data security law and actually a data protection law also, personal information protection law. They have enacted it recently. And what is perhaps heartening is that these frameworks in US, in China, they show a high degree of alignment with GDPR. I'm not saying that it was a requirement that there should be an alignment with GDPR, or it had to be done, but my point is, and which I will come later on to discuss a little bit more, is that it helps if there is a global consensus in any approach when it comes to regulating big techs, and particularly in areas such as data protection. What is also important in China's approach and relevant for big tech that these frameworks put a lot more emphasis on security requirements. And when it comes to data processing, you would see that all these frameworks include similar expectations related to collection and use of personal data. For example, they all have provisions related to fairness, lawfulness, transparency, and accuracy. Now, what is more interesting in China's approach is the regulatory development in China will have a far-reaching implication of how big techs collect, use, and manage their customer data. It imposes additional obligations on big techs that require them to set up a compliance system for personal information protection. It establishes an independent body composed mainly of external members to protect personal information. And these big techs would have to regularly release social responsibility reports regarding how they protect personal information. Now, the second way big techs can be regulated is by developing a new legal framework, completely new legal framework to control the risks generated by big tech's business model. And then we impose certain types of obligations. I don't try to say restrictions, but obligations to ensure a fair play. And a good example of that type of initiatives would be the development that has happened in the field of competition law to prevent big techs from market abuse or data dominance. And up to now, what we have seen around the world that the competition authorities have generally followed a traditional approach to address anti-competitive behavior of big techs, which hasn't really worked that well. And I'm going to discuss about this a little bit later, but I want to mention what the progress have been made in this particular area. Of course, the first is EU's flagship legislation, which is in the process of getting enacted, the Digital Services Act and Digital Markets Act. It has been the political approval has happened. It is going through its course. Both of them are regulations, so it have to be implemented directly into national law of the 27 member states. From my understanding, Digital Markets Act complements the enforcement of competition law at EU and national level. And I will come to both of them a little bit later. But I want to talk a little bit about what has been the approach of UK government. They've been trying to do things not in a great way because we change prime ministers too often. So UK has been trying to scrutinize the market dominance of the big techs. Now, our government issued a consultation paper setting out its proposal for a new pro-competition regime for digital markets back in November 2020. The date is important. This is after Brexit, and this is after, we were definitely out of the European Union. And we want to be seen to the world that we are open for business. We want to be pro-competition and so on and so forth. It proposed, what it does is proposed establishing digital markets unit, so a specialized unit within the Competition and Markets Authority. And this unit would have power to monitor and enforce a wide range of pro-competitive interventions whenever it is necessary. It would have powers to intervene to address unfair and unreasonable terms. But what is very interesting, this regulatory authority would have the power to impose financial penalties up to 10% of global turnover for regulatory breaches. However, nearly 2 years have gone, several rounds of announcements and re-announcements, and the most recently have been in May. We are no closer to seeing this unit getting the statutory power it needs to be an effective force. And this is despite the fact that actually that body has been established in last year. The another area is China. After doing nothing for years, China recently started reshaping its technology regulation landscape. And tech giants like Ant and Didi, they have been targeted for antitrust probes. Just a few years ago, China's tech companies were pretty much immune to regulation. They were the darling of the government because they were standing up to the big techs of the United States and the rest of the world. The CEOs were pretty much idealized, and they were allowed to grow in a nurturing policy environment with complete political backing of the Communist Party. There was no competition from overseas tech giants. And obviously, these companies exploited the legal gray areas. But even China changed. Now, China's aim is not substantially different from those calling for more antitrust action in the US, Europe, or elsewhere in the world. China's largest tech platforms, which the government realized that they have used their market dominance power to destroy the small businesses. And hence, instead of helping to solve the social inequality issues, to provide social stability, these Chinese tech companies contributed more to it. What is striking about China's approach is the speed of the regulation. In addition to the antitrust regulation, China is looking into cybersecurity aspects, and as I said, they have moved very fast when it comes to providing data protection to consumers. Remember, in China, data protection law is very much focused on the private sector. When it comes to government, nothing happens there. Now, in UK, we have been experimenting with something quite radical. Okay, and this is where I just want to talk about something which UK has initiated, and I won't be wrong to say that it is a landmark piece of legislation, Online Safety Bill. It's still a bill, it's still going on, and what it does at its core, it aims to bring accountability and responsibility to internet. Was there no accountability and responsibility in internet? Well, it has never been, and that much of accountability and responsibility in internet as much we see the companies or big corporations would have in the physical world. And for long, although it has been argued that big techs should be held accountable for design and operation of their systems. And we know that algorithms, softwares get developed without taking into consideration a lot of risks, without mitigating the risk. They do not go through that level of safety checks as a toaster in our home probably would go through. And our government thinks, and probably is rightly to think in that way, that we should have a regulation or we should govern them through a regulation by a democratic legislation, and the overseeing should be done by an independent regulator. So we should not be controlled by the Silicon Valley. Lawrence Lessig talked about code is law, but we have moved on. It's been 20 years since he wrote that book, and we have seen that there are obviously good fundamental points in there. You can create as many laws you want, but it is the enforcement of the law which is more important. And when it comes to enforcement, we definitely need technological solutions. But without a legal framework, it hasn't really worked that well. So the bill proposes that our internet regulator, Ofcom, would be responsible for issuing information notices to big tech companies, determining whether they're performing their online safety functions, whether they're taking their responsibility seriously. And interesting, the bill places a duty of care on big techs, which requires them to remove illegal content, but as well as legal but harmful content. This proposed legislation would impose criminal liability on tech executives for likes of Twitter, TikTok, Meta, if they fail to comply with Ofcom's information request. And these executives would be held personally liable and could face jail term up to 2 years if they fail to do so. And in addition to this criminal liability, there are also provisions for fines, and they could be fined for up to 10% of companies' annual global turnover in case there is a violation. Now, this bill has been criticized. This bill has been criticized by, obviously, the big techs, has been criticized by, unsurprisingly, quite vehemently by a number of people in the US who were trying to protect the interest of big techs. But surprisingly, this bill has been also quite vehemently criticized by human rights protectors, or advocates, human rights advocates. Protectors would probably be the wrong word. And the problem is with the definition of legal but harmful. It hasn't been defined in the bill. UK government recently defined harm as a reasonably foreseeable risk of significant adverse to physical or psychological impact on individuals. So reasonably foreseeable risk of a significant adverse physical or psychological impact on individuals. Still, the definition is broad and it still is quite vague. Still, it's not very clear what would fall below this category and how would big techs interpret what is legal but harmful. Article 19, the Human Rights Advocate Group, has been one of the strongest critics of online safety bill. They argue that the bill fails to address the threat to human rights effectively. Although they agree that there is a need for regulation of big techs because of the way they operate, they threaten our freedom of expression, our right to information. They're not very conducive to the healthy public debate, and they often silence the minority voice. So one side, they agree that our rights are infringed or coddled by the big techs, but on the other side, they're saying, look, the way the bill has been framed will actually have a detrimental impact on freedom of speech and expression. And the draft bill has already been years in making. Our new Prime Minister has signaled that she still wants to tweak the bill to ensure that it does not harm freedom of speech and expression, which is perhaps right. We do not want to be in a position like that. Now, that's the UK. So what is Europe doing? And I said I was going to talk a little bit about the competition aspect. Well, in June this year, the European Parliament adopted this flagship legislative package, Digital Services Package. It consists of two legislations, Digital Services Act and Digital Markets Act. And these two legislations are absolutely aimed at regulating the big techs. I was giving a lecture a couple of days ago. I was saying that this is not a legal requirement, which obviously Europe saw, but they also felt it's a political requirement. They wanted to rein in the big techs, the US giants. So these two legislations have two main goals. First, to create a safer digital space in which fundamental rights of all users of digital services are protected. That is the Digital Services Act. And it also wants to, the second objective is to establish a level playing field to foster innovation, growth, and competitiveness in the European single market. And that would be the Digital Markets Act. Now, the transparency provisions in the Digital Services Act would help us better understand how platforms moderate their content and how we get recommendations. So whenever we go online, how we get those recommendations. I always get recommendations about buying things for Liverpool Football Club, which is obvious. I'm a fan. I post constantly about it. That's not a rocket science there. But anyway, for the first time, big tech companies will also need to submit to an independent yearly audit. It will have to give access to regulators and third-party researchers, including civil society, access to its platform data, insights into its algorithmic black boxes. I don't know how it's going to happen because my understanding, you really cannot know what happens in the black box. But yep, that is what the law demands to ensure that there is greater scrutiny and accountability. And what we hope that Digital Services Act will protect European citizens and eventually probably everybody else from intrusive data harvesting. And it will also perhaps for good, will stop these advertisements which uses our personal information, such as sensitive personal information, even religious belief, political opinion, sexual preferences. I would say it's a fair, it would be fair to say that this legislation is a first step towards overhauling big tech's domination or dominant position as a profit-led, surveillance-based business model to one that may finally consider some aspects of risks it creates to human rights. On the other hand, the Digital Markets Act will ban certain practices used by large platforms acting as gatekeepers. It would enable the European Commission to carry out market investigation and sanction, and will have the power to impose sanctions for non-compliant behavior. Digital Market Act will oblige the gatekeepers. By the way, the gatekeepers has been defined in the legislations. I know if I go too much into detail, I will be here for hours. So you have to cross a threshold. By the look of it, the gatekeepers would be the Amazons and Googles and Facebooks of the world. So this Digital Market Act will oblige gatekeepers to provide business users with access to data related to the use of their service, as well as advertising performance data. It will prevent these big techs from unduly ranking their products or services higher than others. So if you go to Amazon, you see Amazon kind of promotes its products higher than other. So that's a detrimental effect on the small businesses, unless that business had a sponsored ad, which will come at the top. That will stop. So there are different elements in the legislation which can be very effective and which can promote a level playing field for the small businesses with these giants. What I'm worried about is compliance. Okay, so this Digital Services Act or the Digital Services Package, both these two legislation, can only be effective if big tech companies comply with the rules in practice. One of the great thing you can do to protect yourself, and I was taught in the law school, is you ask people to create a law which would be impossible to enforce. Okay, and this is why for a long time, people like Mark Zuckerberg, they were saying, oh yeah, create a law to impose rules so that we can comply with privacy and data protection requirements. They knew it's not that easy to create the law which will be enforceable. Now, making platforms abide by rules will require obviously sufficient human and technical resources. I don't know whether we would ever have that, including necessary IT tools and expertise. Probably that is possible. It is also vital that other jurisdictions around the world adopt strong laws to further protect people from harms caused by big tech surveillance-made a business model. That is a step we need to take. So I'm going to conclude. So what would be my conclusions? I'm not sure what I actually have conclusions at this point. I don't even know which way the things are going. Well, for sure, what I can say that big techs have clearly been pushing the boundaries of law. There is no doubt about it, and there was always a need for their practices to be more transparent, which has never happened. The other thing that hasn't worked is the era of self-regulation. You regulate yourself. You decide what is harmful. You decide what is how to protect the users. Recently, a teenager committed suicide in UK just a month ago, and she was into this group for pro-suicide. Why, even after 15 years, we're still having these groups? How it is so difficult to stop these groups from getting created? It shouldn't be too much for Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter to stop it. It's beggars believe why they still are there. So the world is finally waking up to the fact that they have been given too much of power over our economy, our way of life, and even on our democracies. We know the Cambridge Analytica scandal. We know these big techs have bulldozed their competitors. They have used our private information for their own profit. They have destroyed small businesses. 10 years ago, when I used to give lecture on e-commerce to my students, I said, the e-commerce is this brilliant thing. You get to sell from anywhere in the world to anywhere in the world, right? Really? Is that happened? That really didn't happen, did it? We had some progress. Yes, it happens, but these big players kept dominating the market. So that, global selling opportunity hasn't really happened. And I would say that it's all down to big techs in, very aggressive position in the market. We didn't always have the right legal framework to promote cross-border sale of goods and services, but still they played a role. We must also remember that big techs are different from anything we have ever seen in the past, right? Previous monopolists have market dominance. Did we ever have a monopoly? I mean, apart from the news media, which also had regulations, we never had a company which sells products at the same time are responsible for providing us with regulation of speech or dissemination of knowledge that can shape public opinion. Big techs are the editors of the public sphere, both as vehicles of speech and controllers of speech. And we cannot expect that the old ways, the old remedies would work. The reason is simple. To regulate a public sphere, we have to address more than simply addressing the market. It's not always about down to the competition. And is it really possible to develop a coordinated international approach to regulate big techs? The problem is that we know regulations are a result of political interest and functional interest. I'd say that the reason EU is looking into the regulation of big techs is they have a political interest there. On the other hand, take for example UK. Our government has been very proactive, but has become very slow in the process because they want to reflect more time because our Brexit hasn't gone according to plan. Okay, so yeah, not according to the plan. Who had actually a plan? I don't know. Not according to the plan of the people who supported Brexit. Okay, so now they need more time to reflect, consider, and consult to achieve what it claims to be the right balance between the need and the demand to control big tech, and also a desire to signal that the UK is still a tech and innovation friendly country. So you have two different interests here. Ideally, a company as big as globals as a big techs should require a global response. So a global authority have the ability to match with global reach of big techs should come forward to address the challenges these companies face or present. However, at this present point of geopolitical environment, I don't see a globally regulator coming forward or global regulator developing under UN in any time soon. So global consensus is nearly impossible to achieve. New regulatory framework could provide clarity and guidance for the rest of the world. Yes, it would, and it would give the rest of the world some directions. What can be done, what can be achieved. How a balance can be obtained. In terms of reducing, promoting competition and addressing privacy concerns. I'm not saying, I never say this, saying that it is a gold standard. Even GDPR for me is not really a gold standard. But the use regulatory framework could ensure tech companies to take their responsibilities seriously because it's a group of 27 countries, it's a big market. You have to comply with these rules. It makes more business sense to comply those rules elsewhere in the world. And it will create, the way the data protection law in Europe has created an atmosphere that there needs to be a regulation. And if everybody else follows in some form, which is compatible or with what the European Union has been thinking, probably we will have a better way of regulating big techs globally, but even though not really over a global regulator, but in our own blocks or in our own countries. Big techs need to act, and I need to act in the public interest to protect the interest of the consumer. And us as consumers, we need to understand how this technology influences our life, how it controls our life. Finally, I just want to conclude by saying, which I see in a lot of places where I talk about regulation, is a regulation that is ineffective in meeting its objective can be just as harmful to government, to businesses, and to consumers or citizens as no regulation or over-regulation. And over the 2 years, one thing we have understood that knee-jerk reactions actually do more harm than it does any good. So that's all I hope. Thank you so much. Thank you. I'm just going to stop the screen share.
Interesting presentation. So if anyone has any questions, you can use the Q&A widget and put your question there, or you can raise your hand and Gillian will give you a mic. But while people are maybe thinking about that, because I can't see any questions yet, let me ask you one. So
Yep.
I want to push you a little bit on this idea of competition law and whether what we need is something specifically for or about big tech. So you talked a lot about how existing competition law isn't working, but is what we need to rethink the words of competition law? In other words, how markets are defined or something concrete inside that? Or is what we need better enforcement of competition law in this particular context, and training competition regulators up about how these kinds of companies get and define and use market power? And then related to that, if it is the words, in other words, if there is something in competition law itself that should change, should we change it for everything or only for big tech? In other words, maybe another way of putting it is, do we need a Digital Markets Act, or do we just need a better competition law, possibly with amendments that will help regulate big techs, but in a way that doesn't limit it to digital markets?
Thank you. Very good question, Julie. First, I said that I'm not a competition lawyer, but I will try to answer your question. We need to, the competition, this area needs to think the way the competition law works. Okay, the way it works is you have the market entrants, you have these players in, and you have all these companies, and you try to figure out, okay, which company is trying to play a dominant role in the market, and then you go in to investigate. And once you investigate, you find, okay, this is a market dominant player, and it's a monopoly. It's not pro to the people or not pro to the consumers, and then you create sanctions. That model of getting involved at a later stage, looking into from outside at a later stage, worked in a physical world where you can control these companies who has mostly tangible things and benefiting from tangible products. With intangible value, you cannot go in with big techs, like companies like big techs whose biggest commodity is data. You cannot go in at a later stage to determine whether that company is actually in a dominant market position or not. Look at, if the law was adequate, we wouldn't have big techs developing the way they developed. The reason the way they developed, because the law wasn't adequately getting addressed. It is not stopping them to do it. Once you have got value out of that data, there is no way no one can take that away from you. The position Amazon in at the moment can never be changed. Okay, Amazon's position in the market, if you follow what the rules is at the moment, it gives a platform. It allows every other companies to sell there whatever they want to sell. But the algorithm has been designed in such a way that it promotes its own products. If the existing law was good enough, then Amazon would not have been able to do it. And there are a number of lawyers, competition lawyers, who would say that breaking up these companies will not help, because you don't know what you are breaking up. We have seen Microsoft back in early 2000. There was an attempt made to divide Microsoft by the Clinton administration, and which was overruled by the Junior Bush administration, to create two different entities. Microsoft, one that sells operating system, and the one that looks into the browser market. It didn't happen. It didn't work. So my point is, to answer your question, do we need to create a new type of legal framework? Yes, we do, because the way big techs would not have reached the point they have now in terms of market dominance if the existing law was working adequately. And this is why the Digital Markets Act in EU will be a step in the right direction. Do we need a big tech specific legislation? I would prefer that there is a big tech specific legislation, simply because if we try to create two laws which are too many complicated, with have too many things and provisions in it, they become so difficult to enforce. And there are plenty of examples of legal frameworks getting created, trying to regulate both the digital and the physical hasn't really achieved the purpose it set out to do. Your mic is off.
Thank you for the discussion. I think we're at time, so we'll end now, but I know virtual applause. Thank you for the presentation and for beaming in from the UK to let us know what's happening over your side of the world.
Thank you so much, and please, my email address is available, and I'll be very happy to have this. I'm working on this. I'm doing research, but as I said, it's not the competition law I'm looking into. I'm more looking into the Digital Services Act and regulation of content, data privacy, data protection, speech area, and I will be very happy to have a good discussion about this and learn also in this whole process. Thank you so much.
Fantastic. Thank you, and thank you everyone for coming.